Even though the pagans established churches within his kingdom prior to his coronation, Haile Selassie made it known to the world that above all he wants his empire to follow the commandments. In other words, he wants his empire to follow the God of Israel above all. In other words, follow the first commandments. And the first commandments basically saying, do not pray to Jesus, do not pray to Allah, Buddha, whoever, except the God of Israel. So let's read. But God will shoot an unexpected arrow at them, and suddenly they shall be wounded. For what did he say? He said, how should my name be profane, and my glory will I not give to another? Hearken unto me. I am the first. I also am the last. I am Jacob and Israel. Why? You are standing in the house of Jehovah in the courtyards of our God. Praise Jah, for Jehovah is good. Make melody to his name, for Jah has chosen even Jacob for himself, Israel for his special property. That's why Jesus said, unto them ye do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God. In other words, Jesus is telling you, I am not God. He's also saying that he's not Christ either. So while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what think ye of Christ? Whose son is he? They said unto him, the son of David. He said unto them, how then doth David in spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand till I make thy enemies thy footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? In other words, how can I, Jesus, the son of David, be Christ when David is sitting at the right hand of the Lord? And no man was able to answer. In other words, then spoke Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Why? Because Moses is the real Christ. Moses go by the name of Joseph. You see, the head of Jacob. God acknowledged him as the firstborn. Why? Because Jacob is one of God's many names. And he gave him his inheritance. He fixed the boundaries for his tribes. In other words, the real God, the firstborn, has 12 tribes. And out of his 12 tribes, one of his sons is Moses. Why? Because Moses is Joseph. So from him was to spring the man who won the favor of all, dear to God and to men. Moses. You notice the favor. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children. Why? Because Joseph is Israel's favorite son. In other words, even though Moses sprang out of Jacob, no one mentioned Moses as being part of the 12 tribes. In other words, Moses is Joseph. He is God's son. So who is God? God is Jacob. For Jah has chosen even Jacob for himself. And who is Jacob? Jacob became father to Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. In other words, Jesus is God's grandson. So let's watch. Haile Selassie said this: Christianity and Islam are not the only religions in the world. There are many different religions. However, among believers, there are no differences when they serve their country. In other words, in the beginning, it was one God and no religion. What did he say? My advice to all is to fulfill the 10 commandments. You are aware of the contents of the 10 commandments and can elaborate on it. If the nation for which I am the emperor follows and accepts this, since it's also what I accept and follow. And what's the first commandment? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You should have no other gods before me. In other words, you should not be praying to any person except the God of Israel. So did Jesus give the commandments? No, he did not. Did Allah give it? No. Did Buddha? No. So you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above. In other words, they got to say their God is in heaven somewhere. Why? Because it's not a living God. So they have to just make it up. Imagination going wild. So what did he say? For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to the thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. In other words, follow the first commandment, which is to follow God himself. So that's why God himself had to do this. A new Amharic translation from Ge'ez was printed. In other words, the Ethiopian 72-book Amharic Bible is only translated from Ge'ez, realizing that there ought to be a revision from the original Hebrew and Greek of the existing translation of the Bible. Why? Because the pagans added in original Greek and Hebrew to his Ge'ez Bible. So he had to be like, nah, I'm taking that out of it. And who did that? During the reign of Fasilides in the 17th century, basically during the Renaissance period, the Orthodox Church hijacked his coronation. So before he was crowned king, the Orthodox Church became part of the coronation. That's why it says the Ethiopian emperors had to be crowned, and they had to have a special coronation ratified by a special service at Mount St. Mary of Zion. He could not be referred to by the title of Atsa or Emperor of Ethiopia unless he went to them. In other words, they already hijacked and placed their churches within his empire. So what did it says? Don Inigo Lopez de Recalde, the Ignatius of Loyola of history, was the founder of the Order of Jesus, or the Jesuits. They attempt to plant their popish faith and establish their own dominion in Abyssinia. One of the pioneers, Oviedo, who had entered Ethiopia, wrote thus to the Pope: he must be permitted to inform that with the assistance of 500 or 600 Portuguese soldiers, he could at any time reduce the empire of Abyssinia to the obedience of the pontificate. In other words, they've been in Ethiopia prior to the coronation in 1930, planting paganism. Hence, you get this.
This is David, who says, we have friends who do not celebrate Christmas because they say December 25th is really a pagan holiday. While I agree that Jesus may not have been born on December 25th, he certainly was born as described in the Bible. How do I respond to them?
He was born in late spring. In other words, he was born in June when the animals were out. In other words, the real Christmas is in Ethiopia on January 7th. That's when Moses was born, while Jesus was born in the spring. So that's why Jesus says they are sitting in Moses' seat.
Well, in a sense, tell them they're right. You see, the winter solstice a couple of days later was the shortest day of the year, and the pagans had something called Saturnalia. And it was a time of lawlessness because all the laws were suspended. And people, a bunch of singers actually wandered the streets naked singing. And then they had orgies.
In other words, the world has 5 different Christmases. They have it on December 24th, December 25th, December 26th, January 6th, and January 7th. One of them is right, 4 of them is wrong. In other words, the real King of Kings, the real Lord of Lords was not Jesus. It was this man, Haile Selassie I.
He became governor of the province. In 1928, he led the troops that killed Empress Zoditu's husband, who was not of royal blood, and became regent. He became emperor on November 2nd, 1930, and was crowned Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, King of Zion, conquering lion of the seed of Judah, power of the Trinity.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
Your Imperial Majesty, you were 39 years old when you were crowned in 1930.